share the great things in your life with the people you love as often and as much as you can, and be there for them when they want to share the wonderful things in their life with you.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good morning, Rob Farquhar. Previously, episode 438 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been almost 3 years since we last spoke.
I'd just like to tell your wonderful audience what I tend to tell people at the end of every episode of the Page to Play podcast. Be a little dangerous and stop hiding yourself, folks.
That was then. This is now. Rob, how are you doing, my friend?
Angela, thank you very much for having me back on. Thank you, mate. I am doing well.
That's great. So give us an update. What's going on? What's new in your world?
Well, Angela, I think probably the first thing that is worth mentioning is that right after you chatted with me, I think I talked a fair bit about my wife, Vicky, and you decided to actually get her on your show. And I guess the biggest thing that has happened recently was that on Wednesday, the 10th of April this year, 2019, after a battle with liver disease, my wife, Vicky, died. Had she made it to the 14th of August this year, we would have had our 15th wedding anniversary. Mate, you know, after that long together, how can I not still miss her? I think I am doing good. I've had people tell me that I'm doing great, but, you know, yeah, it gladdens me no end that we have that recording of your conversation with her, because I can share it with people, and, you know, for the people who did know her and want a reminder, and for those who didn't know her, I can share with them a little slice of her personality.
It is a fascinating scenario that has occurred in sadness, because she was actually one of two people that I know about on the podcast that passed recently. And what happened with another person is that a friend or a grandchild actually listened to the podcast of his grandmother who passed. And, you know, he left a message and said, you know, thanks for interviewing my grandmother. It's so good to hear her voice. And that's when I realized she passed. And then I started interviewing past podcast guests as a result of that. And then I reached out to you and, of course, to Vicky. And that's when I actually heard from you, right, in an email that Vicky passed. And, you know, as many as conversations I've had, I remember the conversation with Vicky like it was yesterday, because I think most definitely her personality, one, but two, what surrounded how we had the conversation, because she was getting off like he never lets me on his podcast, right? And so I'm very thankful, because now I'm letting that drive me into this new model of conversation with the podcast, where we're checking in with individuals, because life is short, wouldn't you say? I mean, you've just celebrated your birthday. So how is that transition? It's one thing, I know, when someone dies, but events really surfaces the emotions. Does it?
Yes. I mean, heck, the 42nd birthday party in and of itself, I guess that wasn't too bad. But I mean, you know, I tell you what, if there's anything that has been stirring things up, I had a week of leave after my 42nd birthday party, and I spent some of it doing the necessary bits and pieces that, you know, you have to do around your home. I wound up rearranging several bookshelves and taking Vicky's selection of Patricia Cornwell books to a bookshare place in a local shopping mall. And yeah, I mean, living in this place with all of the things that she had and that we had and that we shared, you know, there is oh boy, there is this strange thing, even though you know objectively that your wife is dead, that you saw her body in the hospital, for God's sake. There is this still, occasionally you don't want to change anything because there is this emotional thing, which if I could put it into words, kind of says, she might miss it. She'll be back and she'll wonder where that thing was, even though she is never coming back, even though you know it. There is that thing in you that, it's always tricky talking about emotions when all you've got is words, but
no, it's good. I think I can jump in here because recently we took down some books, and I'm talking about my life's collection here. But the concept of why am I holding on to these things really hit home, and it was difficult to let go of what held emotional values to me. So I can well imagine, Rob, I'm sure not able to feel it to the point that you have, right? But I can well imagine how challenging that must be, letting go.
Yeah, it is. I still miss her and I still want her back. It will take as long as it takes. When it comes down to it, with a woman like Vicky, I think if there is, maybe there should never be a point where no matter what happens to me or who I meet, or perhaps who, God knows, I fall in love with and decide that the two of us are going to, build a life together. If Vicky was worth loving, then she will be worth always in some strange way wanting to share as much as I can of the rest of my life with.
Yeah, I think building is the thing that you'll do, right? You'll not have to go excavate the memory and then build. I think it's building, yeah? It's building.
Absolutely.
Are you still podcasting?
Well, short answer, at the moment, no.
Okay.
Long answer, interesting enough, I think, when we were talking, and, the podcast I would never let Vicky on, it was called Paid to Play. And the idea was I was talking with people who were earning an income from the things that they love doing, which... I don't know. I mean, Vicky was retired, and she would sometimes talk about when she wasn't doing the things she felt like she ought to be doing around the house, which she always bloody did. I would always feel like I wasn't holding up my end of the bargain with, doing stuff around the house. But, that was why I never really had her on the show, and I think, she'd just give me cheek about it every now and again. But it kind of got to the point where I was, interviewing a broad swathe of people. I wound up talking with a fellow in Canada called Scott Doucette, who has a podcasting business. And I think I wound up on his show at one point, and I dredged up this idea, borrowed from the movie Fight Club, of kind of like single-serving friends. I would meet with these people, I'd chat with them for an hour, and, we kind of move on out of each other's lives. And I got a little bit over that. So after that, I tried making a podcast that was actually around my hobby, tabletop role-playing games. And that worked pretty well, except I was still, I think, struggling at the time with trying to work out my own take on the hobby itself. I was still struggling a little bit because with Vicky, she was unwell, I think, the better part of a decade. And yeah, it sometimes made me trying to juggle my hobby with more and more looking after her, with doing my day job. Life got a bit tougher, of course, for the both of us. And it sort of made my anxieties around entertaining and knowing what I wanted and knowing what my friends wanted a little bit sharper. So for a little while, I wound up the podcast and I let my hobby sort of simmer for a little bit. And if there's one bittersweet thing about Vicky's passing is that, funnily enough, I'm getting a bit of a life back and I am getting back into my hobby. And while I'm perhaps not ready to kick off another podcast yet, I hope sometime I will be soon. And I've got some mates of mine who are interested in Resurrecting Only in Death, which was the podcast I was doing before we sort of wound things up a little bit. Fingers crossed.
So the death, is it D-E-B-T or D-E-A-T-H?
D-E-A-T-H, as in the phrase, only in death does duty end. I'm sure it's been coined in various forms or another, but yes, it's the type of onerous pronouncement that you can expect to hear in the Warhammer 40,000 universe in which the podcast was based. So, as of course, it's a role-playing game, so things tend to get not too grim and serious for too long. Hijinks will eventually ensue. But yeah, that was the name of the show.
So what is the thing that you're excited about right now in the midst of everything?
I think really it is getting back into the tabletop role-playing game hobby. from having very little activity. When Vicky and I moved to Cairns in 2005, I tried getting into the RPG hobby, and there was a guy I met named Bruce Paris, who was kind of a cornerstone of the local Dungeons and Dragons scene. And we got to know each other, we got to be friends, and it was sort of like, I'd love to have you at my table, Rob, but we've got one or two too many people as it is, and everyone's schedules are otherwise busy. This is kind of like the only game we've got. So, it didn't wind up happening. And funnily enough, on the day of Vicky's wake, Bruce came over and he told me that because some of the local folks had moved out of town, but they wanted to keep playing, they transferred getting together around an actual table to a virtual tabletop, an online application called Roll20. And he said, mate, we've actually had a couple of folks leave the game. We've got a place or two spare. How do you fancy joining us every Tuesday evening, fortnight, to play Dungeons and Dragons? And I said, yep, Bruce, I would love to. So we've got that. I am also being the game master for a monthly game of Star Wars Force and Destiny, one of the 3 official licensed role-playing games for the Star Wars universe at a place called the Clubhouse Collective, which is in Cairns. And on Saturday nights, fortnightly, I am game mastering a role-playing game called Wrath and Glory, the new official Warhammer 40,000 role-playing game. So it's feeling great getting back into this hobby that I love. And I am looking forward really to trying to meet this challenge of coming up with my own stuff to entertain people with on an ongoing basis. And so that is what I'm really excited about.
I want to say thank you, my friend, because it gives great joy to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And despite the challenges and the sadness that has occurred from the perspective of losing, I believe we do understand that we gain from the present. So to see that you are continuing in the things that you love, I think both brings joy from my perspective of getting back in here and being your podcast accountability partner to say, Rob, are you doing what you said you were going to do? So, it's really good to hear that. In closing, my friend, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
If you're offered the opportunity to do something exciting, grab it and share the great things, the fun things in your life with the people you love as often and as much as you can, and be there for them when they want to share the wonderful things in their life with you. If I want to round this off, that would be it.
Rob, my friend, again, this has been a great pleasure, a pleasure I treasure. Thanks for being on what is inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.